History remembers the Aztecs as brutal, a civilization drenched in blood, obsessed with sacrifice, and devoted to gods who demanded death. But what if that wasn't madness? What if it was logic, a perfect system for a world always on the edge of collapse? For the Aztecs, blood wasn't cruelty. It was currency. It was time itself, the fuel keeping the cosmos alive. Every drop offered on temple altars wasn't just an act of faith. It was an essential payment to keep the sun rising, the rains falling, and the world existing for one more day. Their empire didn't sacrifice because they enjoyed violence. They sacrificed because, in their eyes, not doing so meant the end of everything. This is not a story about savagery or superstition. It's a story about a civilization that believed the universe was fragile and that only ritual could hold it together. If you're ready to see the Aztecs like never before, hit subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Let's uncover the ritual that kept an empire alive. The Aztecs did not believe the world was eternal. They believed it was dying, slowly, inevitably, and only held together by human intervention. This wasn't abstract philosophy or distant mythology. It was immediate, urgent cosmology that shaped every aspect of their civilization. The universe, in their understanding, was fragile, unstable, and constantly on the verge of collapse. According to Aztec belief, the world had already ended 4 times before. 4 previous ages, called suns, had risen and fallen in catastrophic destruction. The first sun was devoured by jaguars, the second was obliterated by hurricanes, the third was consumed by rain of fire, the fourth drowned beneath a great flood. Each time, the gods attempted to create a stable world, and each time, creation failed. Humanity was not living in the first world. They were living in the 5th attempt, the 5th sun, and it too was destined for destruction. This 5th sun, called Nahui Olin, or Four-Movement, was the current era, born from divine sacrifice at Teotihuacan when the gods gathered to create a new world from the ashes of the 4th. 2 gods, Nanahuatzin and Tecusistecatl, threw themselves into a cosmic fire to become the sun and moon. Their self-sacrifice set the celestial bodies in motion, but at tremendous cost. The gods had given everything to ignite this world, and now they were exhausted, drained, barely able to sustain the cosmic order they'd created. The sun that rose each morning was not guaranteed. In Aztec cosmology, the sun was a warrior god named Tonatiuh, locked in eternal battle against the forces of darkness. Every night, he descended into the underworld, fighting through armies of stars and demons. Every dawn was a victory, but a temporary one. Without strength, without nourishment, Tonatiuh would eventually fall. And when he did, the 5th sun would die just like the 4 before it. Permanent night would descend. Earthquakes would shatter the earth, and humanity would be annihilated. Time itself was not an abstract flow in Aztec thought. It was a force that required maintenance, a cycle that needed constant propulsion. The universe operated like a great machine, grinding forward only as long as it received the energy to continue. And that energy had a specific name, Chalcuatl, precious water. But this wasn't literal water. It was blood, specifically human blood, which the Aztecs understood as the most potent life force in existence. The gods were hungry. This wasn't metaphorical language. It was theological reality. Having sacrificed themselves to create the world, the gods existed in a state of perpetual depletion. They had given their essence to make the cosmos function, and now they required replenishment. Without it, they would weaken, the sun would dim, crops would fail, rains would cease, and the intricate balance holding reality together would unravel. Humanity's role in this system was not passive worship. Humans were not simply subjects hoping for divine favor. They were essential participants in cosmic maintenance. The gods had created humanity specifically to provide sustenance, to be the source of energy that kept the universe operational. This wasn't servitude in the traditional sense. It was partnership, though a partnership defined by absolute necessity and unequal power. The Aztecs saw themselves as living on borrowed time. Every day the sun rose was a gift, not a given. Every harvest, every rainfall, every moment of stability existed because the gods still had enough strength to maintain it. But that strength was finite, constantly depleting, always in need of renewal. The calendar itself reinforced this anxiety. Aztec timekeeping was obsessively precise, tracking cycles within cycles, always counting down to critical moments when cosmic energy would reach dangerous lows and require massive ritual intervention. This created a society fundamentally organized around preventing apocalypse. It wasn't that the Aztecs enjoyed sacrifice or sought violence for its own sake. They performed these acts because they genuinely believed the alternative was extinction. In their worldview, choosing not to sacrifice was choosing to let the universe die. It was collective suicide on a cosmic scale. The ritual violence wasn't optional religious practice. It was existential necessity. The fear was not irrational within their framework. They had evidence, or what they interpreted as evidence. Droughts came when rituals were neglected. Earthquakes struck when the gods grew angry. Eclipses, moments when the sun appeared to be dying, were terrifying confirmations that their cosmic model was accurate. The sun could fail. It almost had repeatedly, and only intervention brought it back. Living under this cosmology meant existing in a state of perpetual urgency. There was no distant future where things would simply continue. There was only now, this cycle, this ritual, this offering that might buy another day, another year, another generation. The Aztec Empire was not built on conquest for territory alone, or wealth accumulation, or dynastic pride. It was built on the desperate need to gather enough resources, enough captives, enough blood, enough ritual power to keep the cosmos from collapsing. This was their reality, a world that demanded blood to survive, gods too weak to sustain themselves, and humanity caught in the impossible position of being both creation and fuel. The Aztecs did not sacrifice because they were cruel. They sacrificed because they believed, with absolute certainty, that not doing so would end everything. But belief alone doesn't explain the mechanics. How exactly did blood keep the universe alive? Why was the human heart considered the ultimate offering? And what made sacrifice sacred rather than simply murder? The answer lies in how the Aztecs understood the body itself, and why they saw blood as something far more powerful than just liquid in veins. In Aztec cosmology, blood was not simply a biological fluid. It was tonali, life force, divine energy, the essence that animated all living things. Every heartbeat pumped this sacred substance through the body, sustaining individual existence while connecting that person to the cosmic order. Blood was the physical manifestation of vitality itself, and when offered to the gods, it transferred that vitality directly to the divine beings who needed it to sustain the universe. This understanding transformed sacrifice from violence into transaction. The Aztecs weren't destroying life arbitrarily. They were redirecting it, channeling human energy into cosmic maintenance. When blood flowed on temple altars, it wasn't wasted. It was delivered to its intended recipients, gods who consumed it as nourishment, absorbing the life force and converting it into the power necessary to keep the sun moving, the seasons turning, and reality stable. The heart held special significance as the ultimate offering. Called Yolotl, the heart was considered the seat of consciousness, emotion, and individual essence. It was where tonali concentrated most intensely, the organ that distributed life force throughout the body with every beat. To offer a heart was to offer the purest, most concentrated form of energy available. It wasn't just symbolic. In Aztec thought, it was literally giving the gods the most powerful fuel source humanity could provide. The connection between blood sacrifice and solar movement was direct and mechanical in their worldview. Tonatiuh, the sun god, was engaged in constant warfare during his nightly journey through the underworld. This battle exhausted him, depleting his strength. Each dawn represented his victory, but also his increasing weakness. Without replenishment, he would eventually lack the power to rise. Blood sacrifice, particularly the offering of hearts, provided the energy Tonatiuh needed to continue fighting, to keep ascending, to maintain his cycle. The sun rose not because of physics, but because humans fed it. This created a maintenance schedule for the cosmos. Major rituals aligned with critical moments in the solar and agricultural calendars, points when divine energy was believed to be dangerously low. Solstices, equinoxes, the end of calendar cycles, periods of drought or unusual weather, all triggered increased sacrificial activity. The Aztecs weren't guessing. They had centuries of astronomical observation encoded in their calendar systems, telling them precisely when the universe needed the most support. The human body itself was understood as a microcosm of the universe. Just as the cosmos required blood to function, so did the individual. The parallel was not metaphorical. It was structural. Humans were literally made from divine substance, created by the gods using their own blood mixed with ground bones from previous worlds. This meant every person carried divine essence within them, making human sacrifice not a destruction of something separate from the gods, but a return of borrowed energy to its source. The distinction between killing and offering was absolute and critical. Murder was a crime, punishable and condemned. It destroyed life without purpose, wasting the precious tonali that could have been properly channeled. Sacrifice, by contrast, was elevation. The victim's death served cosmic necessity, their blood achieving something murder never could, sustaining existence itself. This wasn't semantic manipulation, it reflected genuine theological categories that structured Aztec law and morality. Pain had ritual significance beyond mere suffering. The Aztec term tlamatilistli referred to knowledge gained through ordeal. Physical pain during sacrifice wasn't incidental or sadistic, it was transformative. The intensity of the experience was believed to purify the offering, concentrating its spiritual potency. Warriors who died in battle or on the sacrificial stone were thought to experience transcendence, their consciousness elevated through the extremity of their final moments. Pain was the crucible that refined ordinary life force into extraordinary offering. The sacrificial act itself was laden with sacred procedure. Priests underwent extensive purification before performing rituals. Specific days were astronomically determined as appropriate. Victims were prepared through ceremonies that elevated their status from prisoner or slave to sacred offering. The ritual wasn't hasty or casual. It was theater, choreography, and theology combined. Every gesture had meaning, every element symbolic weight. The goal was not simply to extract blood, but to frame the act within cosmic significance that both participants and observers understood. Victims often consumed ritual substances that altered consciousness, possibly reducing fear or inducing spiritual experiences. This wasn't mercy in the modern sense, but practical theology. A terrified, resistant victim would contaminate the offering. A willing or transcendent participant provided purer energy. The ideal sacrifice accepted their role, understanding they were becoming part of something infinitely larger than individual existence. Historical accounts suggest that many captives, after extended ritual preparation and indoctrination, did reach states of acceptance or even eagerness. This system depended on collective belief. If the Aztecs had viewed sacrifice as murder, their society would have been psychologically unsustainable. But because they genuinely understood it as cosmic maintenance, as necessary, sacred, and ultimately beneficial even to the victim who achieved honored status and afterlife reward, the practice integrated into daily life without causing the moral crisis it would trigger in cultures with different cosmological frameworks. The priests who performed these rituals weren't executioners. They were technicians of the divine, specialists who understood the precise methods for transferring life force from human vessels to cosmic recipients. Their black robes matted with dried blood weren't marks of shame, but badges of sacred responsibility. They carried the weight of keeping the universe operational, and that weight was both honored and feared throughout Aztec society. Blood was everywhere in Aztec religious practice, not just in grand temple sacrifices. Nobles pierced their tongues and genitals, offering their own blood regularly. Commoners might draw blood from earlobes or limbs during religious festivals. These auto-sacrifices reinforced the principle: blood was currency, and everyone contributed according to their means. The grand heart sacrifices represented the premium payments, the major transactions that addressed cosmic deficits too large for smaller offerings to resolve. But this raises an unavoidable question. Where did all these sacrificial victims come from? How did the Aztecs maintain a steady supply of offerings without exhausting their own population? The answer reveals perhaps the most sophisticated and disturbing aspect of their system. Wars deliberately designed not to kill enemies, but to capture them alive for the gods. Aztec warfare followed logic that baffled Spanish conquistadors when they first encountered it. Battles that could have ended in total annihilation instead concluded with mass captures. Elite warriors sometimes refused to kill defeated enemies, choosing instead to subdue them. Armies that possessed overwhelming advantages deliberately held back from complete conquest. To European observers trained in total war, this seemed irrational, even suicidal. But the Aztecs weren't fighting to destroy their enemies. They were fighting to sustain the cosmos. The Xochitlal, or Flowery Wars, represented the purest expression of this theology-driven combat. These were ritualized conflicts arranged between the Aztec Triple Alliance and neighboring city-states, particularly Tlaxcala, Huexotzingo, and Cholula. Unlike wars of conquest aimed at territorial expansion or resource extraction, Flowery Wars had a single, explicit purpose: capturing warriors for sacrifice. Both sides understood and agreed to these terms, engaging in combat that was simultaneously deadly serious and fundamentally cooperative in its cosmic goal. These arranged battles followed specific protocols. They occurred at predetermined times and locations, often coordinated around religious calendars when sacrificial needs were highest. Combatants met on designated fields, and while the fighting was genuine and lethal, the strategic objective differed fundamentally from conventional warfare. Success wasn't measured in enemy casualties or territory seized. It was measured in live captives secured. A warrior who killed 5 enemies was competent. A warrior who captured 5 enemies alive was exceptional. The emphasis on capture rather than killing created a unique battlefield dynamic. Aztec weapons reflected this priority. While they possessed devastating obsidian-bladed clubs capable of decapitating horses, they also carried specialized tools for subduing opponents: lassos, nets, and blunted weapons designed to incapacitate without killing. Combat training emphasized grappling techniques, pressure points, and methods for overwhelming adversaries while preserving their lives. The goal was always the same: bring them back breathing for the temple altars. This approach to warfare elevated capture to the highest military honor. The Aztec ranking system rewarded warriors based on the number of live captives they secured in battle. A warrior who captured 1 enemy earned the right to wear specific regalia. 2 captives brought additional honors and privileges. 4 captives elevated a warrior to the elite Quetzalcoatl ranks, the jaguar and eagle warriors whose iconic costumes represented the pinnacle of military prestige. Status, wealth, social mobility, and even access to certain religious ceremonies depended not on enemies killed, but on enemies captured for the gods. War became a continuous ritual cycle, not a series of discrete conflicts aimed at resolution. The Aztecs didn't seek to permanently defeat their Flowery War opponents, because doing so would eliminate a reliable source of sacrificial victims. Tlaxcala, despite being surrounded by Aztec-controlled territory and facing regular military pressure, was never fully conquered. This wasn't military incompetence, it was strategic preservation of a resource. A defeated enemy provides captives once. A perpetually antagonistic neighbor provides them indefinitely. The battlefield itself functioned as the first stage of sacrifice. Captured warriors were immediately marked and processed, their status transformed from enemy combatant to sacred offering. They were bound, but treated with a respect that confused outside observers. These weren't prisoners of war in the conventional sense. They were consecrated individuals whose blood would soon feed the gods. Their journey from battlefield to temple was ritualized, with specific ceremonies at each stage reinforcing their transition from person to offering. Victory in Aztec terms meant successful harvest of captives, not annihilation of enemy forces. A battle that ended with high enemy casualties but few captures was considered a failure, regardless of territorial gains. Conversely, a battle that secured numerous live prisoners, even at significant cost to Aztec forces, was celebrated as triumph. This inverted the calculus of conventional warfare, where minimizing friendly casualties while maximizing enemy losses defined success. For the Aztecs, dead enemies were wasted opportunities. Their blood spilled uselessly on battlefields instead of properly channeled through temple rituals. The army functioned as an extension of the religious establishment. Warriors weren't just soldiers, they were providers of sacred resources, gatherers of cosmic fuel. Military commanders coordinated with priests to ensure campaigns aligned with ritual calendars. The intensity of warfare increased during periods when sacrificial demands peaked, before major festivals, during droughts, after astronomical events that suggested divine displeasure. The military machine synchronized with the religious calendar, its operational tempo dictated by cosmic maintenance schedules rather than purely political or economic considerations. This system created perverse incentives that neighboring states sometimes exploited. Some smaller city-states realized that participating in flowery wars, while dangerous, guaranteed they wouldn't face total conquest. Providing sacrificial victims became a form of tribute that preserved autonomy. Others used the ritual combat framework to settle disputes or demonstrate martial prowess without risking complete destruction. The theological nature of warfare created a strange stability, a system of controlled violence that paradoxically prevented the unlimited warfare that characterized many other imperial systems. Training for Aztec warriors began in childhood and emphasized capture techniques as much as killing methods. Young boys learned to view battlefield success through the lens of live capture. Mock battles and training exercises rewarded those who could subdue opponents without lethal force. The psychological conditioning was comprehensive. A warrior's worth lay not in how many enemies they killed, but in how many they delivered to the gods. This created a military culture fundamentally different from European, Asian, or even other Mesoamerican traditions. The weapons technology reflected these priorities. While Aztec macuahuitl clubs with obsidian blades could certainly kill, they were often wielded with restraint against worthy opponents who might serve better as offerings. Projectile weapons like atlatls and arrows were used to soften resistance and create chaos, but the close combat phase prioritized subduing rather than executing. Entire tactical doctrines revolved around surrounding and overwhelming enemies to facilitate capture, rather than employing the kill-focused tactics that dominated warfare elsewhere. This approach to combat created a military tradition where the highest honor wasn't surviving the most battles or leading the most successful campaigns. It was capturing the most prestigious opponents. An Aztec warrior who captured an enemy noble or particularly renowned fighter achieved fame and status that eclipsed generals who won conventional victories. The battlefield became a hunting ground where the prey wasn't killed but harvested, where success meant returning with offerings that would keep the cosmos functioning. But capturing thousands of victims was only the beginning. Those prisoners had to be processed, prepared, and ultimately sacrificed in ways that maximized their cosmic impact. This required infrastructure, organization, and a center of power capable of orchestrating ritual on an unprecedented scale. That center was Tenochtitlan, and at its heart stood the Templo Mayor, the architectural embodiment of Aztec cosmology, and the stage for humanity's most elaborate attempt to sustain the universe through blood. Tenochtitlan was not simply a capital city, it was a sacred landscape. Every canal and causeway aligned with cosmic geography, every district mapped to celestial patterns. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, the city itself embodied Aztec cosmology, water surrounding land, echoing the primordial division of elements at creation. But at the absolute center of this sacred metropolis rose a structure that defined not just the city's physical layout, but the entire empire's spiritual and political order, the Templo Mayor. The great temple was massive, a twin pyramid complex that dominated Tenochtitlan's skyline. Its dual shrines honored Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun, and Tlaloc, god of rain and agriculture, the two forces most essential to Aztec survival. This wasn't architectural accident, it was theological statement. War and agriculture, blood and water, sustenance through conquest and sustenance through cultivation. The temple declared these dual dependencies in stone and blood-stained steps. The structure rose in stages, each expansion built over previous versions, in a layering that reflected the Aztec concept of cosmic cycles. Archaeologists have identified 7 major construction phases, each enlarging and enhancing the previous iteration. This architectural palimpsest created a physical timeline of imperial power, with offerings and sacrifices from earlier periods buried within the structure itself. The temple was simultaneously building, monument, and cosmic axis, the point where earth, sky, and underworld intersected. Standing at the temple's base, looking up the steep stairways toward the twin shrines, was designed to induce awe and terror simultaneously. The ascent was deliberately steep, the steps narrow and blood-stained. Victims climbed knowing they would not descend. Observers gathered in the vast plaza below watched the entire ritual unfold at a distance that allowed them to see without being so close as to desensitize. The architecture itself was theater, engineered for maximum psychological impact on both participants and witnesses. Sacrifices at the Templo Mayor were profoundly public spectacles. Unlike private rituals performed in smaller temples or household shrines, the great ceremonies occurred in full view of thousands. This wasn't accidental transparency, it was calculated demonstration. The empire's power manifested most clearly not through military might or administrative efficiency, but through this ritual capacity to extract hearts and offer them to the gods. Every sacrifice communicated multiple messages simultaneously: theological necessity, imperial authority, and the consequences of resistance. The priesthood formed a parallel power structure that in some ways exceeded even the emperor's authority. Priests controlled access to the divine, interpreted cosmic signs, determined ritual calendars, and performed the actual sacrifices. Their training was extensive and specialized, taking years to master the precise techniques required. Removing a heart from a living body in seconds without damaging it requires anatomical knowledge and surgical skill. Priests developed this expertise through repeated practice, their proficiency itself becoming a form of sacred power that commanded respect and fear. These religious specialists maintained a distinctive appearance that reinforced their otherworldly status. They never cut their hair, allowing it to grow long and matted with sacrificial blood. They painted their bodies black, wore garments darkened by dried blood, and deliberately cultivated an appearance of ritual pollution that set them apart from ordinary society. They smelled of death, looked like death, and mediated between the living and the cosmic forces that determined survival. Their very presence reminded everyone that the normal rules didn't apply to those who maintained the universe. The theatricality of sacrifice extended beyond the act itself. Victims were often prepared through elaborate rituals lasting days or even months. Some were dressed as gods, impersonating the deities to whom they would be offered. They participated in ceremonies, received honors, and were treated with a strange mixture of reverence and inevitability. This transformation from prisoner to sacred offering to divine representative created layers of meaning that amplified the ritual's impact on observers. The moment of sacrifice itself was choreographed with precision. 4 priests held the victim's limbs across the sacrificial stone. A 5th wielded the obsidian blade, striking with practiced accuracy below the ribcage, cutting upward and extracting the still beating heart. The organ was held aloft, offered to the sun, then placed in a vessel or fed to sacred fires. The body was pushed down the temple steps, where it tumbled to the plaza below. Every element served both practical and symbolic purposes, with nothing left to chance or improvisation. Fear and reverence became inseparable in the Aztec experience of religion. The gods were not benevolent protectors. They were powerful forces that demanded satisfaction. Failing to provide that satisfaction meant cosmic collapse. This created a psychological environment where obedience wasn't enforced primarily through police or military occupation, but through internalized belief that disobedience threatened everyone's existence. You obeyed not because soldiers would punish you, but because the sun might not rise. This religious framework provided extraordinary social control. Conquered peoples were integrated into the empire, not primarily through military garrisons or administrative occupation, but through participation in the ritual system. They provided tribute, including sacrificial victims, and attended ceremonies that reinforced Aztec cosmology. By making conquered populations complicit in the sacrificial system, whether as providers of victims or witnesses to sacrifices, the empire bound them into a shared theological reality that made rebellion not just politically dangerous, but cosmically irresponsible. The emperor, the Tlatoani, derived authority from this religious structure as much as from military success. He was the chief intermediary between humanity and the gods, responsible for ensuring rituals were properly performed. His legitimacy rested on cosmic maintenance. If the sun continued rising, crops grew, and rains came, his rule was validated. If natural disasters struck, it suggested divine displeasure with leadership. This created accountability through theological rather than political mechanisms. The government functioned as theocracy, where religious necessity justified political decisions. Warfare to obtain captives wasn't aggression. It was cosmic duty. Tribute demands weren't exploitation. They were resource gathering for ritual maintenance. Executions of criminals through sacrifice weren't punishments. They were practical recycling of lives that would be wasted otherwise. Every political action could be framed through religious imperatives that made resistance seem not just treason, but blasphemy. The Templo Mayor's prominence in the city's geography ensured that no resident could ignore the ritual reality at the empire's heart. The pyramid was visible from most of Tenochtitlan, a constant reminder of what sustained their world. The sounds of ceremony, drums, conch shell trumpets chanting, carried across the city. The smell of burning hearts and blood permeated the air during major festivals. The temple didn't allow forgetting or ignorance. It demanded constant awareness of the theological system governing existence. But this religious theater served another purpose beyond cosmic maintenance. The Templo Mayor wasn't just an altar. It was a stage for political messaging of extraordinary sophistication. Every sacrifice sent carefully calibrated signals to different audiences, reassurance to subjects, warnings to tributaries, and terror to potential enemies. The ritual that claimed to sustain the cosmos also sustained an empire through calculated displays of power that made conventional armies seem almost unnecessary. Aztec children learned about sacrifice before they learned to read. Their education began with stories of the gods who had destroyed themselves to create the fifth sun, who had shed their own blood so humanity could exist. These weren't cautionary tales or abstract myths. They were foundational lessons about the universe's operating principles. Just as children in other cultures learned that fire burns or water drowns, Aztec children learned that blood feeds the cosmos and death can be sacred duty. The Kalmakak, elite schools for noble children, and Telposhkali, schools for commoners, both incorporated ritual knowledge into their curricula. Students practiced auto-sacrifice, piercing their own flesh with maguey thorns to offer blood during ceremonies. These weren't traumatic ordeals, but normalized activities, performed collectively with peers, supervised by teachers who framed the pain as connection to the divine. By the time children reached adolescence, blood offering was as routine as any other religious observance, its necessity internalized through years of repeated practice. Honor in Aztec society was intimately bound to sacrifice in ways that shaped every social aspiration. Warriors sought glory through capturing enemies for the gods. Knowing their own potential sacrifice in battle or on enemy altars was equally honorable. A warrior who died in combat or on the sacrificial stone was believed to join the sun god's retinue, accompanying Tonatiuh across the sky for 4 years before reincarnating as hummingbirds or butterflies. This afterlife was superior to the fate of those who died ordinary deaths, who faced the dreary underworld journey to Mictlan. Death in sacrifice was literally promotion to celestial honors. Women who died in childbirth received equivalent status, their sacrifice of life to bring forth new life, paralleling warriors' blood offerings. They became Chiwateteo, divine beings who escorted the sun from zenith to sunset, the female complement to warrior escorts who accompanied it from dawn to noon. This elevated maternal sacrifice to cosmic significance, though it also created intense pressure on women, whose bodies became sites of ritual duty as much as personal experience. Families occupied impossible positions when members were selected for sacrifice. To openly grieve or resist would demonstrate misunderstanding of cosmic necessity, potentially bringing shame and suggesting the family doubted the religious framework sustaining everyone's existence. Yet sources suggest genuine sorrow coexisted with public acceptance. Parents whose children became sacrificial victims through war, tribute, or selection as god impersonators experienced the full spectrum of human emotion while navigating social expectations that demanded they frame their loss as honor rather than tragedy. The Ixiptla tradition illustrates this psychological complexity most clearly. Certain rituals required individuals to impersonate specific gods for extended periods, sometimes a full year, living as the deity incarnate before being sacrificed. These god impersonators received special treatment, honors, and privileges. They were simultaneously celebrated and doomed, their path to death marked by ceremony and reverence. For families, having a child selected as Ixiptla brought prestige and spiritual benefits, along with the certainty of losing that child in choreographed ritual death. Consent in this system was neither free nor entirely coerced, but existed in a space between these poles. Individuals raised within Aztec cosmology genuinely believed the universe required sacrifice. Some captives destined for sacrifice reportedly accepted or even embraced their fate after months of ritual preparation and theological instruction. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome, but cultural framework. Once convinced that their death would feed the sun and benefit all existence, some individuals found meaning in their impending sacrifice that made resistance seem selfish rather than self-preserving. Yet class differences created vastly different relationships to sacrificial death. Nobles captured in war expected and often received treatment befitting their status, with sacrifices that honored their rank. They'd been raised their entire lives expecting that death in battle or sacrifice represented the highest achievement. Commoners and slaves offered to the gods lacked this ideological cushioning. Their deaths served the same cosmic function, but their families possessed fewer resources to frame the loss as honor. The theology was universal. The comfort it provided was stratified by social position. The normalization of ritual death permeated everyday life in ways that desensitized populations to violence that would horrify outside observers. Children grew up seeing sacrificial victims prepared and paraded through streets. Temple festivals with their attendant sacrifices were community events, social occasions where sacrifice was backdrop to markets, performances, and gatherings. The line between sacred violence and ordinary life blurred until distinguishing them became artificial. Sacrifice wasn't something that happened occasionally in hidden spaces. It was woven into the fabric of existence. This cultural context made the system internally functional in ways external observers struggled to comprehend. Spanish chroniclers described Aztec society as simultaneously sophisticated and horrifying, unable to reconcile the mathematical precision of their calendar, the architectural achievement of their cities, and the agricultural innovation of their chinampas with the constant ritual bloodshed. But for Aztecs, these elements weren't contradictory. The sacrifices enabled everything else. The blood fed the cosmos that allowed cities to flourish, calendars to function, and crops to grow. Psychological mechanisms that in other contexts would be pathological became adaptive within this framework. The ability to witness or participate in ritual killing without developing trauma required either genuine belief in its necessity or sophisticated compartmentalization. Most Aztecs likely employed both, sincere faith in cosmic maintenance coexisting with psychological strategies that allowed them to function within a system demanding continuous violence. The alternative, rejecting the framework entirely, meant confronting the possibility that all this death served no purpose, that loved ones had died for nothing. Belief became preferable to that void. The system's internal logic was coherent if one accepted its initial premises. Once you believed the sun required feeding, that gods needed nourishment, that human blood contained the energy to sustain reality, everything else followed with terrible inevitability. Sacrifice wasn't excess or cruelty, but response to cosmic necessity, no more optional than breathing. Within this worldview, the question wasn't why sacrifice, but how could we not sacrifice and call ourselves responsible? This internal coherence made the system seem unbreakable from within, sustained by generations of shared belief and social reinforcement. But all systems, no matter how deeply embedded, possess breaking points. For the Aztec sacrificial order, that breaking point arrived not through internal collapse, but external shock. The arrival of forces that didn't share their cosmology and possessed the military power to impose a different reality. When the Spanish came, they didn't just conquer an empire, they shattered a universe. The Aztec Empire ruled over approximately 5 million people across central Mexico, yet maintained relatively few permanent garrisons in conquered territories. This wasn't administrative oversight or military weakness, it was strategic brilliance. The empire had discovered something European colonial powers would later rediscover. The most effective control comes not from physical occupation, but from psychological domination. And nothing dominated the imagination quite like mass human sacrifice performed with theatrical precision. Major sacrificial ceremonies functioned as imperial spectacles deliberately designed to overwhelm foreign witnesses. When the Aztecs rededicated and expanded Templo Mayor in 1487, sources claim tens of thousands of captives were sacrificed over 4 days. Modern historians debate the exact numbers, but the scale was undeniably massive and intentionally so. Representatives from tributary states and rival powers were invited, sometimes required, to attend. They watched from designated viewing areas as lines of captives stretched across causeways, waiting their turn on the temple steps. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to enemies of the empire. But it went deeper than simple threat. The sheer organizational capacity required to orchestrate such events demonstrated administrative sophistication that rivaled the violence itself. Feeding, housing, and processing thousands of victims required logistics that announced imperial competence alongside imperial brutality. The Aztecs weren't just saying, "We can kill you." They were saying, "We possess resources and organization so vast that your resistance is meaningless." Tributary states received differentiated treatment calibrated to their political relationship with Tenochtitlan. Allies and cooperative subjects witnessed ceremonies that emphasized cosmic necessity rather than punishment. The sacrifices they observed were framed as collective duty, maintaining the universe for everyone's benefit. Their own tribute obligations, including providing sacrificial victims, were positioned as participation in this essential work rather than exploitation. This created a narrative where submission became virtue and resistance became selfishness that endangered the cosmos. Resistant or recently conquered populations saw different ceremonies with darker emphasis. Sacrifices of captives from their own ethnic groups or city-states carried explicit political messages. The ritual elevation of victims, dressing them as gods, honoring them before death, transformed into psychological warfare. Your warriors, your nobles, even your relatives became offerings to Aztec gods, their bodies tumbling down Aztec temple steps. The honor afforded to victims made resistance simultaneously dangerous and futile, since even captured warriors served the empire's purposes through their deaths. The fear generated by these displays was both immediate and enduring. Witnessing mass sacrifice created trauma that outlasted the event itself. Foreign dignitaries returned home haunted by what they'd seen, their reports spreading through their populations and amplifying the terror beyond those who'd actually attended. The Aztecs understood that one person who witnesses sacrifice and tells 100 creates more effective control than executing 100 in isolation. They weaponized storytelling, ensuring their brutality became legend that exceeded even the brutal reality. This system legitimized the emperor through demonstrable cosmic efficacy. When Moctezuma II performed grand sacrifices, and the rains subsequently came, when harvests followed major rituals, when the sun continued rising after particularly elaborate ceremonies, his authority was validated by apparent divine approval. Subjects and tributaries witnessed the emperor fulfilling his cosmic responsibilities, maintaining the universe through proper ritual performance. Political power merged with religious duty, making challenges to the emperor not just political dissent, but cosmic sacrilege. Ritual became the empire's most sophisticated propaganda tool. The Templo Mayor's festivals operated on a precise calendar that created rhythm and predictability. Populations across the empire synchronized their lives with Tenochtitlan's ritual schedule, attending local ceremonies that mirrored the capital's grander events. This temporal alignment reinforced the capital's centrality, with all of Aztec civilization oriented toward the cosmic maintenance performed at the empire's heart. Time itself flowed from Tenochtitlan outward. The brilliance lay in making ritual participation seem voluntary and necessary rather than imposed and arbitrary. Unlike tribute systems based purely on extraction, where subjects give because they must, the Aztec system convinced populations they gave because the universe demanded it. Providing sacrificial victims, attending ceremonies, supporting the priesthood, all became acts of cosmic citizenship rather than submission. This transformed the empire from occupying force into religious necessity, far more powerful than military control could achieve. Control without constant occupation became possible through this theological framework. Once a population accepted Aztec cosmology, once they believed the sun required feeding, that drought came from insufficient sacrifice, that their survival depended on proper ritual, physical garrisons became unnecessary. The empire existed in their minds, in their fears, in their sincere belief that resistance endangered not just themselves, but existence itself. Soldiers could be withdrawn. The ideology remained. Some subject peoples genuinely internalized this worldview, becoming sincere participants in the ritual system. Others maintained private skepticism while publicly complying, understanding that open resistance was suicidal. The empire didn't require universal genuine belief. It required universal compliance, whether motivated by faith, fear, or pragmatism. The result was the same. A system where millions obeyed because the alternative seemed unthinkable. The strategic flexibility this provided was remarkable. The Aztecs could wage war to obtain captives, then sacrifice those captives in ceremonies that intimidated potential future enemies while reassuring existing subjects of cosmic maintenance. Every military campaign fed the ritual system, and every ritual strengthened the political order that enabled military campaigns. War, religion, and governance formed a self-reinforcing cycle that concentrated power in Tenochtitlan while requiring minimal direct administration of distant territories. Imperial communication operated through ritual spectacle more than administrative decree. Changes in ceremonial practices, the scale of sacrifices, which gods received emphasis, all conveyed political messages to those literate in the empire's religious language. Increasing sacrifices to Huitzilopochtli signaled militarization and expansion. Greater emphasis on Tlaloc suggested agricultural concerns and possible tribute adjustments. The ritual calendar became a broadcast medium communicating policy to populations who might never receive written orders but attended ceremonies revealing imperial priorities. This system possessed inherent fragility masked by its apparent strength. It required continuous success to maintain legitimacy. Droughts, military defeats, or other disasters that sacrifice seemingly couldn't prevent created dangerous questions about the entire framework's validity. The more the empire depended on ritual rather than direct control, the more catastrophic any crack in religious authority became. As long as the sun rose and harvests came, the system was nearly unbreakable. But if the cosmic maintenance appeared to fail, the entire structure risked collapse. Yet for this system to function, it required more than just political engineering from above. It needed popular acceptance from below. Societies where ordinary people genuinely believed, or at least accepted, that sacrifice was necessary and honorable. This raises the most disturbing question. How did the Aztecs create populations willing to offer their own children, to celebrate when family members were selected for sacrifice, to see ritual death not as tragedy, but as transcendence? When Hernán Cortés and his expedition landed on the Gulf Coast in 1519, the Aztec Empire stood at the height of its power. Tenochtitlan was among the largest cities in the world. The tribute system functioned efficiently, and the ritual calendar maintained cosmic order as it had for generations. Yet within 2 years, the empire would be shattered, its capital destroyed, and its religious system, the framework that had sustained Aztec civilization, exposed as powerless against forces it had never imagined. The Spanish arrival triggered immediate theological crisis. Aztec cosmology had categories for neighboring peoples, tribute states, and enemy warriors. It had no framework for comprehending bearded men arriving from the eastern sea in floating mountains, accompanied by animals never seen in Mesoamerica and wielding weapons that produced thunder and death at distances ritual combat never contemplated. Initial interpretations attempted to fit these strangers into existing mythology. Perhaps they were representatives of Quetzalcoatl, the returned god-king. This uncertainty paralyzed decision-making at critical moments. The cultural incomprehension was mutual and absolute. Spanish conquistadors, shaped by Catholic theology and European warfare, viewed Aztec sacrifice as satanic barbarism requiring immediate suppression. They saw temples as houses of demons, priests as servants of evil, and ritual offerings as murders demanding divine punishment. The Aztecs, conversely, viewed Spanish refusal to participate in cosmic maintenance as dangerous insanity that threatened universal collapse. Each side encountered the other through frameworks that made genuine understanding impossible. Cortés weaponized this incomprehension strategically. He allied with Tlaxcala and other peoples who'd suffered under Aztec dominance, presenting himself as liberator while pursuing conquest. These allies hadn't rejected Aztec cosmology entirely. Many shared similar religious frameworks, but years of providing sacrificial victims and tribute had created resentments that overrode theological solidarity. The empire's ritual system, which had provided political control, now became vulnerability. Subjected populations saw opportunity to escape the sacrificial economy by supporting invaders who promised to end it. The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 devastated more than physical infrastructure. As Spanish and Allied forces cut off causeways, blockaded canals, and prevented food supplies from reaching the capital, the ritual system began failing in ways that shattered its theological foundation. The priests continued performing sacrifices, extracting hearts, and offering blood to maintain cosmic order. But the sun still rose over a dying city. The rains came, but crops couldn't grow under siege. The gods received their offerings, yet the empire crumbled. Disease accomplished what military force alone couldn't. Smallpox, introduced by the Spanish and to which indigenous populations had no immunity, swept through central Mexico with apocalyptic efficiency. Historical estimates suggest the population declined by 50 to 90% within a century of contact. This demographic catastrophe occurred on timescales that defied ritual explanation. The priests sacrificed more victims, performed grander ceremonies, offered increasingly desperate prayers. The deaths accelerated regardless. This created the most devastating theological crisis imaginable. The ritual system stopped working. For generations, Aztecs had witnessed apparent correlation between sacrifice and cosmic stability. Droughts ended after rain ceremonies. Harvests followed agricultural rituals. The sun rose each dawn after night-long ceremonies fed it. But now, despite increasing sacrificial efforts, the universe appeared to be collapsing, exactly as their cosmology predicted it eventually would. Except it wasn't collapsing from neglect. It was collapsing despite their desperate attempts to maintain it. The psychological impact was catastrophic. If sacrifice couldn't prevent this devastation, what did that say about everything they'd believed? The deaths of relatives, the captives offered, the blood spilled across centuries. If it couldn't stop this, had it ever accomplished anything? Some clung more desperately to traditional practices, interpreting disaster as sign they hadn't sacrificed enough. Others experienced crisis of faith so profound it shattered their entire worldview, leaving them vulnerable to Spanish missionary efforts that offered alternative theological explanations. The Spanish systematically dismantled the physical infrastructure of Aztec religion. The Templo Mayor was destroyed, its stones used to build Mexico City's Catholic cathedral. Priests were killed or forced to convert. Sacred texts were burned. Ritual objects were melted down or destroyed as idolatrous. This wasn't just conquest. It was theological extermination, deliberate erasure of the framework that had structured Aztec reality. Within decades, the visible apparatus of the old religion had been largely eliminated. Yet the deeper tragedy was internal collapse. Even without Spanish destruction, the system had revealed its own impotence. The gods had failed to protect their people. The blood offerings had failed to prevent catastrophe. The cosmic maintenance that justified empire, warfare, and sacrifice had proven unable to maintain anything against threats it hadn't anticipated. For a civilization whose entire structure rested on the efficacy of ritual, this failure was existential collapse more complete than mere military defeat. Survivors faced impossible choices. Continue practices that seemed demonstrably ineffective, adopt the conqueror's religion that at least appeared ascendant, or exist in some syncretistic middle ground that blended elements of both while fully satisfying neither. Many chose the last option, creating the hybrid religious culture that characterizes Mexican Catholicism to this day. Indigenous theology wearing Christian liturgy, old gods hiding behind saints' names, ancient ceremonies disguised as Catholic festivals. The Aztec world didn't just end politically, it ended cosmically. The fifth sun, which they'd labored so desperately to sustain through sacrifice, had apparently set despite everything they'd done. The universe had ended, not in the earthquake and darkness they'd expected, but in disease, conquest, and the slow suffocation of a civilization whose gods no longer answered. An empire without its gods wasn't an empire at all. It was a haunted landscape where survivors wandered among ruins of both stone and faith. But here lies history's most uncomfortable question. Were the Spanish chroniclers who documented these events recording what actually happened or creating the narrative they needed to justify conquest? How much of what we know about Aztec sacrifice comes from reliable evidence, and how much from propaganda designed to paint indigenous peoples as barbaric savages requiring salvation through colonization? Separating historical truth from colonial distortion requires confronting how myth, horror, and politics have shaped our understanding of sacrifice itself. The numbers have always been contested. Spanish chroniclers claimed the Aztecs sacrificed tens of thousands annually, with some accounts suggesting 80,000 victims during the Templo Mayor rededication in 1487. Modern archaeologists and historians debate these figures intensely, with estimates ranging from hundreds to thousands per year across the empire. The truth matters because numbers aren't just statistics, they're narratives. Exaggerated counts served Spanish political purposes. Minimized counts risk sanitizing genuine violence. Finding historical truth requires navigating between propaganda and apologetics. Spanish chroniclers had compelling reasons to emphasize Aztec brutality. Conquest required justification, both to the Spanish crown, concerned about costs, and to the Catholic Church, troubled by mass killing of indigenous peoples. Portraying Aztecs as demonic savages engaging in industrial-scale human sacrifice provided moral cover for colonization, framed as rescue mission. If indigenous peoples practiced such atrocities, then conquest became salvation, forced conversion became mercy, and exploitation became civilizing influence. The narrative of barbarism wasn't incidental to colonialism, it was foundational to its justification. Bernardino de Sahagún, arguably the most reliable Spanish chronicler, spent decades among Nahua peoples documenting their culture. His Florentine Codex provides detailed ethnographic information, yet even Sahagún wrote within frameworks of European Christianity that couldn't fully comprehend indigenous cosmology on its own terms. His descriptions of sacrifice emphasize horror and Satan's influence, interpreting ritual through theological categories that foreclosed understanding the internal logic Aztecs themselves perceived. The most sympathetic Spanish sources still observed through lenses that distorted what they documented. Archaeological evidence confirms that large-scale sacrifice occurred, but complicates the simplistic narratives. Excavations at the Templo Mayor have uncovered tzompantli, skull racks displaying thousands of human crania. Chemical analysis of temple stones confirms blood residue. Skeletal remains show marks consistent with heart extraction and decapitation. The physical evidence is undeniable. Ritual killing happened on significant scales. But physical evidence can't tell us about meaning, belief, consent, or the internal experience of participants. It confirms what, but struggles with why. What remains genuinely unknown is vast. How voluntary was participation really? How did individuals selected for sacrifice experience their final days? What percentage of victims were war captives versus criminals versus willing participants? How much did practices vary across regions and time periods? Sources filtered through Spanish perspectives can't reliably answer these questions. Indigenous codices might have provided answers, but Spanish systematic destruction of these texts left massive gaps in the historical record. We're reconstructing a civilization partly from the accounts of those who destroyed it. The distinction between religious belief and cruelty matters profoundly, but resists easy categorization. From within Aztec cosmology, sacrifice was necessary, sacred, and ultimately beneficial, even to victims who achieved honored afterlife. From external perspectives shaped by different theological and ethical frameworks, it appears as systematic murder regardless of justification. Both can be simultaneously true in different moral universes. The challenge for historians is describing the system without either condemning it through presentist ethics or excusing it through cultural relativism that refuses all moral judgment. Judging the past with modern values is methodologically problematic, yet humanly inevitable. We cannot, and perhaps should not, shed our ethical frameworks entirely when studying history. But we must recognize when our categories fail to capture how people in radically different cultural contexts understood their own actions. The Aztecs weren't secular moderns who cynically manipulated religion to justify cruelty. They were genuine believers in a cosmology where sacrifice was as necessary as agriculture or warfare, embedded in worldviews we can study, but perhaps never fully inhabit. The danger of simplification cuts both ways. Portraying Aztecs as bloodthirsty savages ignores the sophisticated civilization that built Tenochtitlan, developed complex mathematics and astronomy, created remarkable art, and engineered Chinampa's agricultural systems. But romanticizing them as peaceful peoples, corrupted by warlike elites, or minimizing sacrifice's centrality to their culture, is equally distorting. The Aztecs were neither demons nor victims, but humans who constructed a functioning civilization around premises we find deeply troubling. Holding that complexity without collapsing into either demonization or apologetics requires intellectual honesty about both their achievements and their violence. Sacrifice was a system, not spectacle, though it employed spectacle as tool. It was integrated into governance, warfare, agriculture, timekeeping, architecture, and education. It wasn't an aberration or excess, but foundational to how Aztec civilization functioned. Understanding this doesn't require approving it, but it does require recognizing that sacrifice made internal sense within the framework that structured their reality. They weren't irrational or exceptionally cruel by their own standards. They were logical actors working from premises we don't share. Modern appropriations of Aztec imagery often strip sacrifice from context, celebrating aesthetic elements while ignoring or minimizing the ritual violence that permeated the culture. This selective appreciation allows contemporary engagement with Aztec art and architecture while avoiding uncomfortable confrontation with the worldview that produced it. But historically responsible engagement requires acknowledging the whole system, not just the parts that fit comfortable narratives about indigenous cultures. The academic debates about sacrifice's scale, meaning, and function continue because evidence permits multiple interpretations. Archaeological data confirms sacrifice occurred, but can't quantify exact scales or motivations. Spanish chronicles provide detailed descriptions but carry obvious biases. Indigenous sources created after conquest were influenced by Christianity and colonial pressures. No pristine, unbiased account exists. Every source reflects particular perspectives and agendas, requiring constant critical evaluation and acknowledgement of uncertainty. What we can say with confidence: Aztec civilization practiced human sacrifice as essential religious ritual. It occurred regularly on substantial scales as integral part of their cosmology and governance. The violence was real, systematic, and normalized within their society. It served theological purposes they genuinely believed, and political purposes they strategically employed. It was neither as extreme as the most lurid Spanish accounts suggested, nor as minimal as some revisionist interpretations propose. It was central to who they were as a civilization. This leaves us with the fundamental question that transcends the Aztecs specifically and touches something profound about human societies. What does their story reveal about how civilizations function, what beliefs can justify, and how systems that seem unthinkable to outsiders become normal to those within them? The answer lies not in the sacrifices themselves, but in what kept an empire alive through ritual that its people believed sustained the universe itself. The Aztec Empire didn't sacrifice to appease cruel gods or satisfy bloodlust. It sacrificed because its entire civilization was built on a single, terrifying premise. The universe was dying, and only human intervention could sustain it. Every heart offered, every drop of blood spilled, every ritual performed was an attempt to hold back cosmic collapse that they believed was inevitable without constant maintenance. This wasn't madness. It was a functioning system where religious belief, political control, and genuine existential fear merged into a civilization sustained by collective conviction. The empire didn't survive because of its military might or agricultural innovation alone. It survived because millions of people believed the alternative was the end of everything. What the Aztec story reveals is uncomfortable. Humans can normalize almost anything when convinced it ensures survival. We can transform violence into virtue, fear into devotion, and death into sacred duty. Societies function not on objective truth, but on shared belief powerful enough to structure reality for those within it. The true God the Aztecs worshipped wasn't Huitzilopochtli or Tlaloc. It was survival itself and the terror of losing it. What historical civilizations challenge your understanding of human nature? Subscribe for more stories that reveal how belief shapes reality. Like this video, if the Aztec system made you rethink how societies function, and tell us in the comments, can we judge the past without imposing our present values? Let's discuss below.